मुझे कहा गया कि थोड़ा सा मैं अपना तारुफ करवा दूं. So before I start, I should just explain that my name is Urvashi Butalia and I'm from India. Lahore. And I am basically a publisher who publishes books on women. I work in a small publishing house called Kali. And I have worked largely on issues to do with partition and conflict in our region, which is what I'll be speaking about today. Before I start, I want to say the usual thank you to ASR and especially to the head honcho, Bunny, who has been looking after us all very well and keeping us in hand with an invisible whip. And I want to say thank you also, sometimes visible also. Also thank you to the deputy head honcho who is now based in India, who has a completely different style of functioning but nonetheless as effective, known by the name of Uma Chakravarti. So we have before us a wonderful example of collaboration which we can emulate.
That word.
Now the point is, what can I say after this song? Really, there is nothing else to say, but since I've been given this slot, in some ways also I've been thinking a lot about how to say what I have to say, especially when you come on the last day of a conference that has been as rich as this and as important as this, because many of the things I want to say have already been said, which makes the task both somewhat easier and somewhat more difficult. And I'm going to try and cover a really wide sweep. So I'm hoping that our chair today is lax and gives me a little more time than I'm supposed to have. In any case, in the spirit of collaboration, Farida, who is my successor in speaking, has said I can have 5, 10, 30, 40 minutes of her talk. So I'm going to take advantage of that a little bit. Now, I thought that what I might do is really what I think I can do best, which is to tell you a few stories, and from those stories try to draw some conclusions about the sort of things we've been talking about in the last few days, largely to do with questions of state, citizenship, nations, borders, divisions, and peace, despite the kinds of problems that are created by politics at a larger level. I will start by focusing on partition for reasons that will become obvious to all of you, and also because it has been very much in the air in the last few days. And I also, because it is a seminal event in the history of the subcontinent, but I will go on to look at some of the ramifications of partition in our lives today. And I will examine 3 situations, not in detail at all, focusing only on women. And those 3 are to do with the Gujarat, Pakistan, West Pakistan, if you like, or what used to be known as West Pakistan border, the West Bengal, Bangladesh border, and of course the situation in Kashmir, which is what I will end with. Let me start by saying that some years ago I wrote a book about partition, which is really a book made up of oral narratives, oral histories of people who had lived through partition, mostly on the Indian side of the subcontinent, but some also on this side. And it was a book that examined the histories of women, of children, of people on the margins of society, and of ordinary people, basically men and women. I went into this history for a variety of reasons, and I will just briefly outline these here. One, as an Indian who was deeply concerned at the increasing communalization of our society and the polarization on the basis of religion that was rearing its head, and we could see it all around us. So you could see partition being played and replayed out in smaller ways all around us, and I was concerned about why this was happening. And 2, because what really galvanized me into doing the research in a much more concerted way was the 1984 anti-Sikh riots in Delhi, when Mrs. Gandhi was killed by her Sikh bodyguards, and then there was a kind of orgy of revenge against the Sikhs. And many of these Sikhs were people who had moved to India at the time of partition, and who, when we as citizens, there was a citizens group formed which tried to help by providing relief, rehabilitation, and also offering to simply take witness and take down stories so that reports could be filed, and that was my task in one of the groups. Many of us started to hear stories of partition again. This whole event helped to resurface these stories, and people started to say this is like partition again. We had not expected it to happen to us in our own country. So I was very struck by this and realized then that people of my generation, who are basically first generation children after partition, had actually completely wiped out and ignored this history, and it was because of that that I started to explore the history of partition. The first step in my exploration was to explore the history of my own family, which is a family which was divided at partition, which did not face any particular violence, but the division was extremely deep. My mother's brother stayed behind here in Lahore in my grandfather's house and converted to Islam, kept my grandmother back, and she was, while he was not particularly a believer, she was a very kattar Arya Samaji, which I think most people will understand, a believing Arya Samaj person who actually upheld the taboos of caste and pollution quite strongly. She was also kept back because the property was in her name and for a variety of other reasons, and she lived here. So for us, for my family, partition meant this deep divide in the family, and for 40 years after partition, there was absolutely no contact with my uncle until I got interested and I came to find him in Lahore and started to talk to him. I will not go into the details of what we talked about, that would then take the whole day, but it was a very, very painful coming to terms for both him and me, and through me, my mother and her family, who were there by then all in India. Because they had believed something of him, his motivation had been something different, he had believed something of them, and as a result, the family had actually completely broken apart. When I talked to him, there were two things that he said to me, and of which I'll repeat only one to you, which to me symbolized in many ways what partition was about. When I was talking to him at length one day, and he was telling me about his innermost feelings, and he said this was the first time he had actually talked about these things to anybody. I asked him one day, why are you telling me this? Because you don't know who I am. I could be anybody. You could meet me in the marketplace and you would not recognize me. Why are you talking to me of your most intimate thoughts? And he said to me, and I'll say it in Urdu first and then I'll translate it into English. He said, "Beti, pehli baar main apne khoon se baat kar raha hu. First time I'm talking to my own blood." And I was very, very moved by this statement because, of course, it throws open all these questions of home, family, nationhood. What is your country? What is your nation? Where is your home? Who is your family? Who is your blood? What are these ties of blood that bind us across these borders and so on? Later, after I came back to see him for the second or third time, my mother, who had by then learned that her mother, that is my grandmother, who he had kept back with him, had actually lived for 9 years after partition, which is something that we never knew. And her children, 8 of them living across the border, never knew when their mother had died. They had only speculated and guessed, and it was through me that they found out that she had actually lived for 9 years after partition. My mother asked me a question which she wanted me to pose to him, and that to me symbolizes a second important aspect of this whole event. And the question, and I should say that my mother is not a particularly religious person at all. But the question she asked me, and again I'll say it in Urdu first and then in English. She said, "Usse puchna, usne meri maa ko jalaya tha ki dafnaya tha." Ask him whether he buried or cremated my mother. And I was really shocked at this, and I asked her why she was so concerned about this, because she's not at all religious, and she said, "Just ask him." And of course I asked him, and I learned that he had buried my grandmother, and then I asked him if he would take me to her grave, and he said, "Nahi, abhi nahi, I'm not ready to show this to you yet." I still have not seen it, but on one of these trips I hope that we will have reached an equilibrium where I will be able to do this with him. But in any case, although these two statements do not in any way touch on the extreme violence of partition, but they do in many ways encapsulate the depth of the experiences that people went through, and I think in some ways the enormous ground that we need to cover if we are to reach across those borders. And there has been a continual reaching across at an individual level, but I think we need to be aware of what lies beneath all this if we have to actually start reaching across this. Now, from my own family history, I went on to explore other histories which I will only again just mention because there's not really time to go into them. I started to look, as all feminists must do and as something that inside us drives us to do, the histories of women. And we have talked in this conference about the histories of rape and abduction of women during partition, so I will not go into those. We know the scale of these. We know that there were more than 100,000 women, and the numbers will never be exactly clear, who were raped, abducted, taken away by men of the other religion, taken away by men of their own religion. And the complication around this is, of course, that unlike the 1971 Pakistan-Bangladesh War of Liberation, it was not the army raping the victims or raping women in Bangladesh, it was people of two communities raping each other's women. So there were actually no clear lines between who was the aggressor and who was the victim. In some ways, so many people were implicated in this that it is very difficult to reach across those boundaries for, with things like an apology or reconciliation or what, especially because the rape of women in these particular cases is so shrouded in silence. Many of these women later were recovered or rehabilitated, and I use these words in quotation marks, by the two states, by the Pakistani and Indian state. Many of them were not accepted back into their families. Many of them were housed in homes and ashrams and had to live their entire lives out there. But some of them stayed with the men who abducted them. Some even fell in love with them. Some even made happy marriages. So the issue gets further and further complicated by this whole inclusion, if you like, of relations of pain and hurt and love into relations of violation. When you sort of stitch these two together, it gets even more complicated to know how to deal with that. Lesser known history is the history of family violence, when families kill their own women in order to ostensibly protect them from being raped by men of the other religion. In this conference, we have heard people talk about this whole concept of beej bona, to sow your seed, and it came up particularly in the context of Bangladesh, when somebody, I think, was saying the other day that even people in middle-class society in Pakistan were saying, well, so what if the women there are being raped? After all, the seed of a fairer strain of human beings will be sown over there, that sort of thing. So this fear of the religion being polluted through rape and through the sowing of the seed of the other religion inside women was a fear that led many families to either kill their own women or many women to take their own lives. And this kind of death is extremely valorized inside communities because these are honorable, supposedly honorable deaths. These are martyrdoms of women. These are women who gave up their lives for the community or the nation, but they don't find really a place in history. And you see that at the time of partition, there are huge discussions on the question of raped and abducted women and on the exchange of these women in parliament among men. And of course, the discussion is couched in terms of our honor and their honor, our numbers and their numbers, not really in terms of the rights of these women and what they want, but there is no reference to the family deaths. Also, because the myth that we want to uphold in times of conflict is that the violence always comes from the other side, not from ourselves. And I think this blows open that myth that there is a lot of violence that communities exercise on their own women and that we need to look at. I also looked at the histories of children because children are the absent actors in these, particularly in times of conflict. When we were discussing Bangladesh that day, somebody spoke of the statement that Sheikh Mujib Rahman made, that the orphan children or the children of children of rapes were actually did not belong anywhere. And I was struck by how similar this history is to what happened at partition. There was also a whole debate about where these children belong, because while you could recover women who had been raped or who had sex with men of the other religion, and you could somehow purify them by putting them through a religious ceremony, it was very, very difficult to do that to children because you could not tell where the Muslim blood started and where the Hindu blood ended in their veins. So these were huge numbers of orphaned and destitute and abandoned children at that time. And I think we need to turn our attention, and we see this history today being repeated in Kashmir. one of the hugely largest statistics in Kashmir is of orphaned children. And there is really nobody to take care of them because all state facilities are collapsed and there are no families to take care of them. These were some of the histories I explored, also the history of untouchables, and I mentioned that only to point to the fact that in times of conflict, often the conflict is couched in terms of a battle between two opposing or three opposing communities. And we often forget that there are other communities who make up our very diverse societies, whether it is India or Pakistan or Bangladesh, and that these communities are also deeply affected by the conflict. Untouchables formed one such community during partition. So did Christians, so did Parsis, as we have seen from Urvashi Butalia's book. And I think we need to turn our attention to all of these because these are the ramifications of conflict that we tend to forget about because we see it so much in terms in which it is actually presented to us as the two or three major opposing forces in it. The untouchables during partition were largely located in Punjab. And because they were a political force at that time, unlike, say, women whose the violence against whom was of an individual nature, or they had to live it out in an individual way, were at least able to put forth their demands. And one of the demands they put forth, which is not really known about very much, is for a land of their own, saying that if Muslims can get Pakistan and Hindus can get Hindustan, then we would like our own land, which is called Pakistan. And they gave a geography to it. They chose the majority areas where there was a majority in Punjab and said this is where we would like it to be located. So again, I think this raises for us problems about what we see as movements for, you can call them whatever, separatism, liberation, whatever, and the sort of needs and demands of the different communities who are located inside these movements. Okay, I will say no more about partition except to mention this one incident very quickly before I move on to the other things, and that is that in August of last year, I made what I call one of the many necessary journeys that all of us have to make if we are to start the process of healing in this particular history. I visited a village in Rawalpindi with one of the people that I interviewed for my book, who was then a young man who had faced a lot of violence. What had happened was that his family had moved from a village called Sentha to a village called Thora Khalsa because Thora Khalsa in Rawalpindi district was a Sikh majority village where they thought they would be safe. In Sentha, there was the only Sikh family in the village. As it turned out, they faced extreme violence in Thora Khalsa from their own community and from the attackers. And at that time, people from Sentha came to ask them to take them back, offering to give them shelter, and they refused to go, not trusting them, saying these are Muslims and who knows, they might betray us. This man, whose name is Veer Bahadur Singh, has never forgotten this rejection on the part of his father and has always wanted to go to his home village to offer some kind of apology, reparation, whatever. And we went together and I asked him, why is it that you want to go? What will you do when you're there? And again he said to me three things which I think are extremely significant. Again I'll say them in Urdu first and then I'll say them actually in Punjabi because he said it in Punjabi to me. He said, "Beta ek baar ladai kar liye to ki reh janda, uske baad dosti karni hai na." And he wanted to go back for that. And then I asked him, "Theek hai, tusi dosti karni." He said, "What? Once you have fallen, what is there left but to make up?" Sorry, I should have translated. And I then asked him, "What will you do when you're in the village?" And he said, "There are two things I want to do. I want to drink water from the well over there, and I want to eat in the house of a Muslim." Because as Sikhs, as Hindus, they had practiced the customary untouchability that Hindus practice towards both Muslims and untouchables, and his particular mission was to actually make up this. And I was struck by two things. One, that he wanted to do this, and two, that it was possible for him. Because I thought to myself, and I could be wrong in this, but I thought, this kind of thing is possible so much more easily for men than it is for women. Because for women to be able to make this journey across the borders, and I don't mean the literal border, but across any kind of borders, to offer any kind of hand of friendship, has to mean that the women have to have the access to that public space, has to mean that they have to be able to speak about what they have lived through, and their experiences are so deeply layered in the many silences around this that it is very, very difficult for them. So in some ways it is almost a luxury. for women to be able to do it. And I was thinking that day when we were all taking the resolution, and I was thinking that we can as activists do this, but I don't know how many women who have lived through the experience can actually make that move. And it is very important for us as activists to be able to work with them to perhaps enable this move. I don't know how we do it, but it's just one of the thoughts that entered my head. Now I'll move on from this background to some of what I see as the long-term ramifications of partition in our lives at the two borders of India, three borders if you like. And I can quickly mention three very interesting situations. The ramifications of partition develop in our lives in very many ways. And I'm not saying that these are the only places you see it. I think you see it in our daily interaction, you see it in the media, you see it in the programs, you see it in the political rhetoric, you see it everywhere. But in these three instances, it comes up most sharply for a variety of reasons. On the Gujarat-Saurashtra border, on the Kutch border, there is no land frontier between India and Pakistan. The international boundary lies in the water. By its very nature, that boundary is constantly shifting because it is not marked with anything stable in the water, and the water current moves it, all sorts of things move it. On either side live people who are by profession fisher folk. They are poor people. They are, at least in India, largely Dalits. They often stray into each other's waters when they are fishing because obviously they don't know where the boundary lies. Once they stray into each other's waters, they are picked up, caught by the security forces on either side, and often they're jailed, and sometimes they're in jail for periods ranging from 6 months to 3 years and more. What happens to their wives? What happens to their children? In India, and I can speak only of India because we are now done any research on the Pakistan side, these women who are poor anyway are then left to fend for the household. They often have to sell their bodies. They fall into prostitution because they need money. They cannot claim any compensation from the state because although in actuality they are widows because they think their men are probably dead or not going to come back, but they don't have a body to produce. And unless you can produce a body, you cannot actually be recognized by the state as a widow. They do not know whether their husbands are lost at sea or whether they've been picked up by the security forces. Sometimes they remarry, and then the husband turns up after 3 or 4 years, and they don't quite know what to do, and so on. And then, of course, they are left with the burden of having to manage their homes, their households. Sometimes they are able to claim compensation with the help of some local NGO or something, and then, of course, it's taken away by father-in-law, brother-in-law, or some man who enters their life, and so on. On the other side, on the India-Bangladesh border, at partition, as we all know, there was a man called Radcliffe, who the British called, a lawyer who had never actually visited India, who knew very little about it, and who drew the boundary for them. And Radcliffe was holed up in Simla, and he had census statistics and maps and things. He drew the border. Now, what happened was when the boundary was being drawn, princely states like Kashmir, like Hyderabad, various others were given the option of joining either country. On the India-Bangladesh border, or then the India-Pakistan border, there were two princely states on either side. One was called Rangpur and the other was called Cooch Behar. For many years, Rangpur and Cooch Behar had been attacking each other and conquering territories within each other. So they had pockets. Cooch Behar owned pockets inside Rangpur, Rangpur owned pockets inside Cooch Behar. At partition, both states said they did not wish to join either country and wanted to stay independent, so they did. 2 years later, both decided that they did not wish to stay independent, so Cooch Behar, being a Hindu kingdom, joined with India, and Rangpur, being a Muslim kingdom, joined with Pakistan, later became Bangladesh. This left pockets of territory of either country inside the other country. So there are currently about 122,000 acres of Indian territory inside Bangladesh, which are located inside Rangpur, and about 96,000 acres of Bangladeshi territory inside India, which are located inside the erstwhile state of Cooch Behar. These territories are known as Chitmahals. Chitmahals means places from which revenue is collected, because these used to be places from which revenue is collected. What happens to the people inside these states, inside these territories? They don't belong to anyone. Indian citizens living inside Bangladesh, they face attack, violence, theft, rape, loot all the time. If somebody attacks their house, who do they go to? They cannot go to a police station in Bangladesh because that police station has no jurisdiction over them. They cannot cross the border in India to come to the police in Haldibarri because, of course, the police has no jurisdiction inside Bangladesh territory. Same thing applies to Bangladeshis inside India. The people most at risk are the women, because they cannot even go out into the jungle to defecate because it's so unsafe. Anybody can pick them up, and many women fall into prostitution, are picked up, taken away, and sometimes they are sexually abused and brought back when the families don't want them back. The same old story. So I don't need to go at length into it, but this is one of the kind of ramifications of the situation. And then let's turn to Kashmir. Now before turning to that, I want to just mention that in these two situations, you see all the questions of the state, what is the responsibility of the state, borders and boundaries, what they mean to ordinary people. When people in Rangpur or Kuch Bihar wish to cross the border to shop or to just work in the other country, it's very easy. Because in a way that border people have access to the border and can cross it, they do, and all they need to do is the border security force has a fixed rate which is split between the Indian and Bangladeshi forces. So when we want to collaborate, we can. And this rate is 800 rupees, and you pay 800 rupees and it ensures safe passage. Nobody will trouble you along the way. And they can charge such a low rate, partly because many of the people crossing are poor people, and partly because there is such a volume of crossing that they can make up their money on that. So you can imagine the difficulty of crossing with your passport and the ease of crossing in this way. But the passport privilege is one that is allowed to us who are recognized as citizens by the state, and the easy privilege goes to those who are actually stateless, nowhere people, have no privileges, no education, no passports, no documents, no judiciary, no legal rights, nothing. But they have this possibility. Often, sometimes the Indians from Rangpur cross over into India and go to Haldibari and places in the market. They sometimes live there along the banks of the river, and they do stone crushing. And somebody was talking about, Kalki Nazmum, there was this wonderful thing about stone crushing, and I was very much reminded graphically of this picture of these women sitting along the banks of the Tista in Haldibari and crushing stones, because this is what they do for a living, and then they get arrested for being illegal Bangladeshi immigrants. And no matter how much they argue that they're actually Indians, they have no documentation to prove it. So what is it that these states are doing, to their citizens? And yet, those citizens need that state. In this conference, we've been talking about, women rejecting, critiquing the state, and yet for those people, that's what they need. They need that intervention on the part of the state, they need that security, they need that legitimacy of citizenship which the state has to give to them. Okay, now, in Kashmir, it's, as you know, between Indians and Pakistanis, Kashmir is a very, very troubled issue. I'm not going to go into the history of it at all. We all know it. We see it sometimes similarly, sometimes differently. I'm really going to look specifically at what is happening to the women in these last 10 or 12 years of conflict in Kashmir. And I think that in some ways, in many discussions we've had on Kashmir, formally and informally in this meeting, I've been struck by 2 or 3 things. One is that we are often told, Indians are often told by the Pakistanis that we're very nationalistic about Kashmir. There's probably a lot of truth in that, but I'm not taking a nationalistic line. I frankly don't know what line to take on Kashmir. I frankly, the issue is so complicated, so troubled, so politicized, that I don't know whether I would argue for self-determination, whether I would argue that it be part of India, whether I would argue that it be part of Pakistan. I don't know. The second thing is that I've heard often people saying, and both Indians and Pakistanis and others, that the way to a solution in Kashmir is to involve the people, which is true enough, nobody would argue with that. But I think that when we talk about the people, none of us, feminists and otherwise, think of women. Where are the women's voices in the entire peace process in Kashmir? Absent, zero, you don't see them. Is there a woman in the Hurriyat? The only voice of a woman that has been heard in Kashmir, and that also only marginally, so marginally is almost not to count, is the voice of the Dufrani Millat. And that also was quite a while ago. So you don't actually hear women's voices in Kashmir. Yet what is happening with the women? Raped by security forces, we know this well. Raped by militants, also, which is on a large scale but hardly talked about because of the fear of speaking about it, and because it is such a complicated question. You can more easily attack the state than you can attack those who are seen to be fighting for your liberation, obviously. So, rape by the militants does not begin. Hospital facilities are almost absent because doctors and others have left. Large-scale abortions of women, what happens? They are not allowed by Islam. And I'm talking of largely Muslim women now in Kashmir. So what happens? How do these women get these children aborted? They have to go to the hospitals. There are no facilities. Often they are paramedics who operate on them. And it leads to huge complications. There are doctors who have talked about the kinds of complications that it leads to. Apart from the medical complications, what happens is every woman who comes to the hospital, she cannot come alone, she has to be accompanied by a man. And then, as often happens, the beds are taken over by the men. So, the men are sleeping in these wards on the beds which are meant for the women. The women cannot actually sleep there because how can you be on the same bed with a man, even if he is somebody who is a relative? You cannot. And in any case, it is a kind of public exposure of, it is a kind of violation of the private space that you have inside which women are supposed to function. And suddenly they have to get used to this. Education has almost completely finished. And what is happening is that the few statistics that we have show us that levels of domestic violence in Kashmir are rising. Because what is happening is that the violence of the outside world is being brought into the home. Because the men are so brutalized outside, they come into the houses and take it out on the women. The women cannot speak about it. Because in the hierarchy of violence that comes with this kind of conflict, the external violence is supposed to be much more serious than the internal violence. ये तो होता ही है घरों में. So how can you refer to this when all that is happening outside? And the norm of violence, domestic violence, rises and rises and rises. So if we ever get a situation of peace in Kashmir or a resolution of the problem, which I think everybody in this room would hope for, whatever kind of resolution it is, will the women be able to raise the question of domestic violence and its rise? I think not. Because when peace has been achieved, it's peace, and really the internal spaces don't any longer really count. So there is that kind of problem that is coming up. When the men go missing from families, or the children go missing, we have interviews with women whose children have joined the militants or been taken away by security forces or have disappeared. And as a result, what they have done is they are so fearful of this happening to other children, they have withdrawn them from schools, kept them in the house. And then, of course, they need money to live on because the husband is no longer around, he's no longer earning. So what happens is the children get pulled into child labor, and you begin to see that the household becomes a unit where work is being done in order to earn money. And who are those vulnerable people? They are the children. I don't need to mention the orphans. There are huge numbers of orphans. The widows, there are huge numbers of widows in Kashmir. And until recently, this was the same problem that you see in Gujarat, that if you were a widow, you could not claim compensation until you produced a body, but because there have been so many disappearances, you cannot produce bodies. Now, women lawyers in Kashmir have fought, well, some years ago they fought, and they got through an amendment which says that if after 7 years the man has not turned up, then the woman can theoretically be considered a widow and she can seek compensation from the state. It's one thing to be able to seek, and to know that you can seek compensation is quite another to be able to draw upon it. Inside families, what is happening is, because of the violence and stress and trauma that women are facing, relations are changing inside families. Psychologists who have been working there now say that because of this continued stress, women become much more aggressive inside families, and you start to see the breakup of the family, so that say breakup of the extended family, father-in-law, mother-in-law, jo bhi hai with her. So any support that the woman had is disappearing. These are some of the things that are happening with women in Kashmir. I have with me a couple of interviews with women that I thought I would read out, but I don't actually have the time. But if you want to look at them, they're here. And I have not mentioned, of course, the increasing entry of women into violence, both as recruits of the security forces, sometimes out of motive of revenge, sometimes because they need the money badly, and into the militants of the different factions, out of a commitment to whatever it is that they are fighting for, and then there's sexual harassment inside those things, which are, of course, in the layers of silence around these things, something that we never actually can address easily or speak about. I want to turn in the end to the question of what can we do about this? I basically described some of the things that that we think that have come alive for me, if you like, and for me it was really the extension of the work on partition that led me to all of these things. But within India, the women's movement, women's groups have stayed off Kashmir for a long, long time. Why we were talking about this, Umar raised it in the very first session on the first day, because we somehow think that politics is dirty and we need to keep out of it, and we can keep on doing our work in other areas, but the arena of electoral politics, the arena of these kinds of major political discussions is something that we cannot easily enter, and therefore we stay away. For the same reason, women's groups have stayed outside. That Kashmir is basically a battle between the two countries, the state and the security forces and the militants and so on, the security forces and the militants and so on. We have no place in it. But actually we do. We have a place in it, and it was not until several feminist journalists visited Kashmir and women's groups started to go there to do independent investigative reports on the status of women that they came back with this thing saying that many Kashmiri women feel that the separation between India and Kashmir is very deep and lies also inside the women's movement. And it is then that activists from the women's movement have started to try and cross those borders and do some work in Kashmir. When Bunny was last in India, she was saying to me, "मुझे समझ नहीं आता है कि अभी Indian औरतें कश्मीर क्यों जाने लगे हैं?" And I think that इसीलिए जाने लगे हैं because in all conscience you cannot any longer ignore what is happening on your own borders. And I think that we need to turn our attention there, not only to Kashmir but also to the two other situations I've described and the many others like that. I want to end by saying that there are many ways in which we can use the dirty word collaborate in raising the issues around women's involvement in women, the impact on women of these conflicts. For example, we can actually demand the release of people who are men who are in prison on either side of the border. We can actually, I noticed that in the film that Nazri showed, that there was an Adivasi woman from Rangpur, and if the Bangladeshi women are able to go into Rangpur to meet Adivasi women, perhaps it's only the next step forward to go and locate women in Chikmahals and talk to them. We can reach out and we can perhaps work together across the country. And I think similarly, we can try to do something in situations within the borders of our country. And as we are trying now in Kashmir, I don't know if we'll succeed. And I would say, I don't know if Pakistani women are raising the issue of what is happening with women in Pakistan, Pakistan side of Kashmir, or whatever the terminology is. I'm trying to Azad Kashmir. I mean, I just think that we can try to do some of these things. So I just want to leave it at that. And although I have not overtly raised issues of what does the nation mean for women, what does the state mean, what does citizenship mean, and so on. But I think in some ways they are all implicit in the questions I've been raising, and I hope that we can get back to them in the discussion. Thank you.